in the heart of Constantinople, behind curtains spun from gold and silence. They say you could hear the screams through the bathhouse tiles. There are men who become kings, and there are kings who become monsters. And once in a generation, one emerges who is something far worse, something not entirely human. His name was whispered across the empire with a shiver. Not in the markets, not in the mosques, and never in front of the palace walls. He was not a conqueror. He won no wars. He built no monuments. But he left scars so deep, they outlived marble. This is not the story of Suleiman the Magnificent, nor Mehmed the Conqueror. This is the story of Ibrahim I, the mad sultan, the torture king, a man raised in silence, crowned in shadows, and consumed by something darker than madness. He was born into a world of velvet and leather, gilded prison where royalty and paranoia danced hand in hand. In the Ottoman Empire, the throne was never inherited by love. It was taken by force, fear, or the death of your brothers, usually all three. Ibrahim was the youngest son of Sultan Ahmed. The first his brothers were murdered, one by one, in quiet rooms. He survived only because his older brother Murad IV decided to spare him barely. Instead of execution, Ibrahim was locked away. Imagine this: you're 6 years old. The walls are damp with mildew. The only light seeps through a slit in the stone. No books, no music, no human touch, save for the eunuchs who feed you. You are told nothing. You learn nothing. The only thing you hear is silence, and sometimes the muffled screams of someone being strangled with a silk bowstring outside your cell. This place had a name: the Caves, the Cage, a special part of Topkapi Palace, built for royal blood but soaked in terror. Here, princes waited in limbo, not for freedom, for death. Ibrahim spent 22 years inside it. By the time his brother Murad died after decades of opium, cruelty, and slaughter, Ibrahim was the last male heir. They pulled him from the cage, barefoot and trembling. He believed it was a trick. He had seen this before, heirs summoned from darkness, only to be executed on the marble floor. He begged them, he screamed. He reportedly refused the crown, thinking his brother still lived, and this was a cruel jest. They had to drag him from his cell and show him Murad's dead body. Only then did he stop shaking, and then he became sultan. But power is a strange thing. When you give a shattered mind absolute rule, what do you get? You don't get justice. You don't get peace. You get an empire ruled by ghosts. At first, there was hope. A nation exhausted by Murad's tyranny saw in Ibrahim a chance for healing. They didn't know the mind they had just enthroned had been fermenting for 2 decades in a steel womb of isolation. He emerged not as a man but as something far more volatile. He developed obsessions with women, with animals, with superstition, with pain. They said he wandered the palace at night in silk robes, whispering to himself, checking doors, and muttering incantations to ward off demons. He took concubines by the hundreds, demanding women shaped like animals, or bathed in honey, or smelling of jasmine and rot, and when he tired of them, no one knows how many were thrown into the Bosphorus. Some say over 280 in one night. This is the tale of a man whose mind had been hollowed by fear, then handed a scepter, a sultan, who surrounded himself not with viziers but torturers, who punished disloyalty with flaying, boiling, or the slow crush of iron weights. A ruler whose most trusted advisor was a sorcerer who read omens in entrails. But we're not there yet. Not quite. This is just the beginning, because what Ibrahim did next, what he ordered done in secret rooms beneath the imperial harem, was so depraved, so beyond even the nightmares of his age, that centuries later, it's still spoken of in fragments, in shadows. Let me take you there, back to the stone corridors of Topkapi, the walls thick with incense, the fountains whispering in the garden. But listen closely beneath the sound of water, of silk, of slippers brushing the tile. You may still hear the cries, because behind the splendor of the Ottoman Empire, beneath its golden glory, there existed a darkness, and at the center of that darkness was Ibrahim. To understand Ibrahim, the man who would become the Ottoman Empire's most tragic sovereign, we must first step into the world that made him. It is the early 1600s. The Ottoman Empire, once a roaring engine of conquest and civilization, now groans under the weight of its own contradictions. At its zenith, it had stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, from the Caspian Sea to the coasts of North Africa. Its sultans were not mere kings. They were shadow caliphs, lords of a divine mandate, chosen to rule both body and soul. And yet by the time Ibrahim came of age, this empire, swollen with gold and ritual, had begun to crack. The streets of Constantinople were crowded with traders and spies. The markets overflowed with silks, spices, and whispers of rebellion. The old Janissary elite empire's once loyal soldier slaves were no longer defenders of the Sultan, but a brewing storm, corrupt, violent, increasingly disloyal. The provinces groaned under taxation. The palace halls, once echoing with the voices of philosophers and poets, had grown eerily quiet. The Sultanate, like a dying tree, still bore fruit, but rot had set in beneath the bark. And into this world of decay, Ibrahim was born. He entered life in 1615. The son of Sultan Ahmed I and a concubine of Greek origin named Kaksum. Kaksum would later become one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, a puppet master behind the veil. But for now, she was a whisper in the harem, one of many. From birth, Ibrahim's life was shaped not by luxury, but by fear. Ottoman succession was not a game of inheritance, it was a blood sport. For centuries, a cruel practice ruled the palace fratricide. When a sultan died, his sons did not share power. Instead, the strongest or the fastest murdered the rest. Strangulation was preferred over beheading. No blood could be spilled. A bowstring would do. Ibrahim watched his brothers disappear, one by one. He was still a child when he was first locked inside the caves. This cage wasn't metaphorical. It was a real place, an apartment within the Topkapi Palace, cut off from the world. No windows, no sunlight, no speech, except from eunuchs, sworn to silence. He was kept there for 22 years. We must pause here. Consider this: the human brain, especially the developing brains, wired for connection, for stimulation. A child deprived of language, of light, of human comfort, does not grow. Ibrahim was not educated in the ways of statecraft, military command, or diplomacy. He was not taught to rule. He was barely taught to live. What thoughts form in a boy who has only his breath for company? What dreams haunt the man who's never been allowed to dream freely? In 1640, Sultan Murad IV, the last brother, a brutal ruler who had outlawed alcohol while secretly drinking himself to death. Murad had also restored some order to the empire. Through sheer terror, he died suddenly, likely from cirrhosis, without a living heir. And so, all eyes turned to the cage. At first, Ibrahim refused to leave. "They want to kill me," he reportedly cried. "They tricked me before." It took the Grand Vizier, several court officials, and even his mother to convince him that Murad was truly dead, that the throne was now his. And so, on February 9, 1640, the cage opened. Ibrahim emerged into sunlight for the first time in decades. The man they crowned was not whole. Let's linger for a moment inside the palace. Topkapi Palace, not as it is now, a museum, but as it once was. The air smelled of cedar, rose oil, and sweat. Marble floors whispered beneath velvet slippers. Eunuchs drifted silently through corridors, their black skin gleaming under torchlight. The harem, the sacred heart of the palace, was a labyrinth of jeweled tiles, delicate fountains, and women, hundreds of them, all property of the Sultan. The Sultan's bedchamber, the hazoda, was enormous, domed, bathed in flickering oil lamplight. But Ibrahim, in the early years of his reign, spent little time there. He did not yet know how to command. Instead, he delegated everything to his mother, Kaksum Sultan. This wasn't uncommon. Ottoman mothers often held immense behind-the-scenes power, but Kassum's influence was extraordinary. She controlled appointments, funds, even military campaigns. Some historians believe she was the true sultan during those first few years, but power left unused festers, and eventually, Ibrahim began to reach for it. What followed was a reign that spiraled from fragile stability into nightmare. Ibrahim became obsessed with sensation. He gorged himself on food, perfumes, and women. He demanded ever more elaborate pleasures. Concubines dressed as animals, fed rare aphrodisiacs, or made to play out twisted fantasies. He grew paranoid, believing his court was filled with traitors, spies, witches. He surrounded himself not with wise counselors, but astrologers and mystics. One of them, a man known only as Sinsi Hoka, a former healer and black magician, rose to become his closest advisor. Sinsi was a charlatan, but Ibrahim, desperate for control over his own spiraling mind, clung to him like a drowning man. Meanwhile, The empire was bleeding. Ibrahim's reign saw economic collapse. He devalued the currency to fund his indulgences, causing inflation. He confiscated property from loyal officials, accusing them of disloyalty or sorcery. He ordered brutal executions on whim. In one case, he accused a grand vizier of treason and had him tortured to death, then appointed Sinsi Hoka in his place, a man with no political experience, now running the empire. And yet the court, paralyzed by fear and protocol, continued to bow, continued to call him Potish, a god's shadow on earth. But the whispers were growing louder. Among the scholars, even in the palace, whispers of madness, of women thrown from windows, of drowned infants, of a sultan who no longer saw his people as human. But how does such a man rise and remain? It's too easy to dismiss Ibrahim as simply mad. The truth is more disturbing. He was a product of a system, a machine that prized control over compassion, that turned boys into weapons, or worse, into shadows. The Ottoman royal structure built Ibrahim, and when he cracked, it did not stop him, it merely adjusted. The system swallowed the damage, the rituals continued, the divans met, the imams blessed his name, because in the empire, the sultan was not to be questioned, until he could no longer be ignored. And that moment, when the empire finally turned on its sultan, the moment of true bloodletting and betrayal was still to come. Because beneath the palace, in hidden rooms and candlelit cells, a new horror was unfolding. A theater of pain, a kingdom not of law or logic, but of torment. We will step into the catacombs of Topkapi. We will meet the victims. We will witness the crimes. Because when Ibrahim took the throne, he brought the cage with him. There are stories that resist being told. They slip through the fingers of historians, whispered only in shadows, footnoted in dusty manuscripts that no one wants to read. But they happened. They left marks and bodies, on stone, on the collective memory of a people who dared not speak his name aloud. In the depths of the Topkapi Palace, beyond the perfume-slicked marble of the harem, below the imperial baths and garden pavilions, there was a door. It was said that once you passed through it, you did not return whole if you returned at all. That door led to Ibrahim's room, a place without records, but not without screams. The transformation had been gradual. Ibrahim, released from the caves, had entered the world as a half-formed man, paranoid, impulsive, and emotionally infantile. At first, the court indulged his eccentricities. Who would deny the sultan his fancies, no matter how strange? If he wanted women doused in ambergris and milk, so be it. If he preferred his chambers perfumed with musk, strong enough to make guests faint, that could be arranged. But soon, those appetites darkened. He grew obsessed with physical perfection, especially among his concubines. He demanded specific shapes, weights, and features. Those who displeased him were dismissed, sometimes beaten, but not always dismissed. One of his earliest victims was a girl named Nasir, a concubine of Persian descent. Beautiful, intelligent, and outspoken, she refused to bow low enough. During a bath, Ibrahim had her whipped, then burned with hot tongs, then, without warning, drowned in the bathhouse cistern. Her death was never recorded, but her to court rumors echoed through the marble halls for hours. Then came the drownings. The Ottoman harem was home to hundreds of women concubines, wives, slaves, and servants. Most were never touched by the sultan. They waited endlessly, hoping for a glance, a favor, a chance to bear a royal child. But Ibrahim, in a fit of rage after hearing that one of his concubines might be plotting with Kaiksem, his own mother, a culling. It happened in the dead of night. The women were summoned, told to gather by the courtyard fountain. Guards arrived with silk cords, as was tradition, but not to strangle. They were led silently to the windows of the harem's sea-facing rooms, and one by one, they were thrown into the Bosphorus. Some screamed, others begged, some tried to swim, but their long robes dragged them down. The death toll. Historical sources vary. Some say 8, some say 4, but one chronicler, who dared write anonymously years later, gave the most chilling number, 280. Women drowned because the sultan dreamed of betrayal. It didn't end there. In fact, that was just the beginning. Ibrahim began to experiment with pain, not out of vengeance, not even out of punishment, out of curiosity. He believed that suffering revealed truth, and he wanted truth in everything. His court, his lovers, his bodyguards, even his physicians. He had dungeons retrofitted with devices of medieval cruelty, thumbscrews imported from Venice, stretching racks designed by captured Hungarian engineers, iron cages too small for a child. He watched from behind veils as suspects were tortured. Sometimes he asked them questions, sometimes he did not. In one particularly documented case, he accused a palace tailor of evil eye, a common superstition in the empire. The man was strapped to a bronze table, naked, and slowly flayed. His skin was reportedly stuffed with spices and hung in the bathhouse as a warning. To whom no one knew. The tailor had never spoken to the Sultan. Cinci Hoka, his mystic advisor, encouraged this madness. He claimed the stars demanded sacrifice, that the empire was plagued by spiritual enemies, that to protect his throne, Ibrahim needed to purify his court through pain. And so Ibrahim purified. He purified his viziers, his guards, his cooks, his concubines, and even his favorite horse, which he drowned in wine after a dream in which the animal confessed treason. Then came the infants. Perhaps the most horrifying accusation surrounding Ibrahim was what happened to the royal offspring. It was custom for the Sultan to father many children. Ibrahim had numerous concubines and several known sons, but one day he began accusing them, his own infants, of being demons, of being born with false blood. Some say he ordered 2 of his own sons thrown into the cisterns beneath Topkapi. Others say the children were smothered in silk. No historian has been able to confirm the full truth, but infant graves unmarked, nameless, were later found buried beneath the palace garden. As the screams multiplied, silence fell over the empire. The court was paralyzed. To speak against the Sultan was death. To resist his orders was suicide. Even Kakesum, once the most powerful woman in the Ottoman world, found herself locked out, her influence slipping. She had created a monster, and now she could not unmake him. But what truly cracked the empire was not just the blood, it was the absurdity. Ibrahim, convinced that his empire was cursed, ordered the sacred relics of Muhammad housed in the palace bathed in rosewater and chained to the throne. He believed the prophet's mantle would protect him from assassination. He wore it under his robe. He slept with it beside his bed. He screamed at night that ghosts were entering his lungs. In a final moment of madness, he ordered the empire's entire treasury, 6 years' worth of gold and jewels, to be poured into the sea. Why? Because a sorcerer told him the mermaids demanded tribute. That act, senseless, irreversible, was the final straw. The Janissaries revolted. The ulama, the religious scholars, declared him insane. And Kakesum, his own mother, finally moved. She bribed the guards. She opened the gates. She handed her son over. Ibrahim was dragged from his chambers barefoot, his robes soaked in urine and wine. He screamed he was a prophet, that Allah would curse them all. He was imprisoned in the cage once more, but this time there was no release. On August 18, 1648, a bowstring was brought to his cell. The guards were silent. They strangled him on the same marble floor where his brothers had died. He was 33 years old. The Ottoman records call him Ibrahim the Mad, but even madness cannot explain it all. Because what happened inside those walls, beneath the golden domes and calligraphic verses, was not just the unraveling of one man, it was the unraveling of a system that built palaces on blood, that locked children in cages, that confused power with godhood, that taught a boy that love was weakness and mercy was death. And when that boy became a man, and that man took the throne, he simply gave back what the empire had taught him. We will witness the fallout. The empire would never fully recover, and neither would those who survived him, because long after Ibrahim's body turned to dust, his shadows remained. The body was still warm when they locked the cell. No royal burial, no funeral march, no public mourning, just silence. Ibrahim, the 25th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, was dead, strangled by his own guards, with the approval of his mother, the Grand Vizier, the Janissaries, and even the terrified court eunuchs who had once obeyed his every whim. The bowstring was ceremonial, woven from silk, soaked in oil, and blessed by imams so no blood would be spilled, because it mattered, even then, that the Sultan die cleanly. Even in madness, ritual still ruled, but death was not an erasure. Ibrahim was gone, but the consequences of his reign were only just beginning. In the corridors of Topkapi, servants whispered of curses. The marble baths still smelled faintly of rose, oil, and iron. And in the nursery, the infants he had left behind orphaned, their mothers drowned, or silenced, would grow up with eyes wide open. The empire itself did not collapse overnight, but something fundamental had fractured. The Ottomans had survived incompetent sultans before. They had even survived cruel ones. But Ibrahim was different. He had taken the machinery of the empire, the sacred rituals, the divine language, the sultan's divine image, and twisted it beyond recognition. His successor, Mehmed IV, was just 6 years old when he was crowned, a child sultan, a puppet, and so began what history now calls the Sultanate of Women. For over 30 years, it would not be sultans who truly ruled the Ottoman Empire but mothers, grandmothers, wives, queens behind the curtain. Chief among them, Kaksem Sultan. She had outlived her son. She had orchestrated his death. And now, she ruled again, this time as regent to her grandson. But power is never permanent, and legacies made of blood do not endure gently. The Janissaries, the very soldiers who helped remove Ibrahim, became increasingly unstable. They had tasted the power to dethrone a sultan, and they liked it. Riots broke out. Grand viziers were overthrown. Entire military campaigns were abandoned. The treasury, emptied by Ibrahim's oceanic offerings and palatial indulgences, could not be replenished fast enough. Tax collectors were sent to the provinces, but instead of bringing back revenue, they were often lynched. Corruption spread. From the courts of Anatolia to the ports of Egypt, governors began acting as warlords. The empire was hemorrhaging, not from invasion, from within. And yet, perhaps the most tragic decline was not economic, but human. We return again to the palace. Not the throne room, not the court, but the harem, now hollow. After Ibrahim's mass executions and drownings, the harem became a place of fear. The fountains still trickled, the peacocks still preened in the gardens. But the women, the few who survived, no longer sang. They whispered. New concubines were chosen with extreme caution. No woman wanted to be noticed. Beauty became dangerous. Personality, a liability. One concubine, Akhenaten, famously gouged her own face with coral to avoid being selected. She was not punished. She was thanked. Even the eunuchs changed. The Kisla Uga chief, black eunuch, of the harem, once one of the most powerful figures in the palace, withdrew from political life entirely. He was said to have developed tremors, and refused to speak Ibrahim's name ever again. The eunuchs had once been mediators, whisperers, keepers of secrets. After Ibrahim, they became ghosts, seen, but never heard. And what of the people? To the average citizen of Constantinople, Ibrahim's reign had been a blur of rumors and bread shortages. But the trauma rippled outward in other ways. Midwives began refusing palace assignments. Mothers prayed their daughters would be born plain, so they'd never be taken to the harem. Poets stopped writing about the Sultan altogether, and in the mosques, during Friday's sermons, the Imam's traditional prayer for the Padishah began to falter. Some Imams mumbled his name, some skipped it entirely. God's shadow on earth had become something unspeakable. It wasn't just emotional. The political ripple was real. The empire's enemies watched the turmoil with sharpened knives. In the west, Venice began preparing for war. In the east, Safavid Persia saw opportunity. And in the north, Cossack raiders struck Ottoman outposts with impunity. The once invincible aura of the empire, its divine mystique, had cracked. And that crack could not be sealed with rituals or robes. But perhaps the darkest consequence of Ibrahim's rule was this. He taught the empire that insanity could rule without challenge, that fear could outweigh reason, that a single man, broken by a system, could break the system in return. Because Ibrahim didn't seize power in a coup. He didn't bribe his way to the throne. He was handed it by tradition, by law, by blood. The system had worked as intended, and that is perhaps the most terrifying truth of all. So how do you recover from a sultan like Ibrahim? You don't. Not really. The Ottomans tried. They buried him quietly. They cleansed the palace with prayers and incense. They restructured the court, reigned in the harem, elevated new viziers, passed reforms. But it was cosmetic. The empire never returned to its golden age. And as the 17th century dragged on, the sultans became shadows. The real rulers were the viziers, the mothers, the soldiers, the ghosts. Ibrahim had shown them what a man with no soul and too much power could do, and once you've seen that, you cannot unsee it. We will examine the modern echoes of Ibrahim's reign. The genetic trail of madness, the archaeological discoveries beneath the palace, the records that were sealed for centuries, because sometimes history doesn't end when the body dies. Sometimes it festers. Centuries have passed since Sultan Ibrahim I gasped his final breath under the silk bowstring. But his story didn't vanish with him. It lingered in secret documents, in scars buried beneath the palace, in the DNA of his descendants. Because madness leaves residue, and pain has a way of echoing forward, long after the screaming stops. In 1924, the Ottoman Empire, after over 6 centuries, formally ended. The Republic of Turkey rose from its ashes, and with it came sweeping reforms. A rejection of rule, a secular constitution, and a determination to erase the most shameful chapters of imperial history. Among them, the reign of Sultan Ibrahim. For decades, archives were sealed. Artifacts vanished into storage. Historians were warned. Some doors should stay shut, but not all of them listened. In 1996, a team of Turkish archaeologists and historians from Istanbul University was granted limited access to previously unexplored substructures beneath Topkapi Palace. Their goal was modest: to map forgotten storage tunnels. What they found instead, beneath the harem courtyard, in a chamber never before catalogued, was a sealed crypt. Inside, the skeletal remains of 9 women, all aged between 14 and 25. Their bones bore no trauma, no blade marks, no fractures, only water erosion. They had drowned. Carbon dating placed their deaths in the early 1640s. They were not buried. They were stacked, limbs tangled, skulls tilted, fingers still curled. No royal records mentioned them, but in the margins of one account written by a palace scribe under pseudonym, there was a phrase scrawled in trembling script: "The Bosphorus took them, but the walls remember." Modern researchers cross-reference the find with oral histories from palace descendants. One elderly custodian, descended from palace staff, claimed to have been told by his grandmother, when the Padishah howled at night, the river drank the girls. No names, no prayers, just disappearance. That same expedition uncovered torture implements in a sealed cistern, rusted metal cages too narrow for adults, Venetian finger screws, and a bronze purification rack traced to a Hungarian blacksmith working in Istanbul during the 1640s. None of these had ever been inventoried in Ottoman military records. They weren't meant to exist. But the palace wasn't the only place hiding remnants of Ibrahim. In 2021, a genetics team at the University of Cambridge published a controversial study analyzing the Y chromosomal lineage of Ottoman male descendants. They found repeating mutations linked to bipolar affective disorder and schizoaffective symptoms, most pronounced in lineages stemming from Sultan Ahmed I Ibrahim. Was his son. The researchers were cautious, stressing that mental illness is never the result of a single mutation, but the patterns were striking. One descendant anonymous in the study described vivid hallucinations and lifelong insomnia. He reported dreams of drowning girls in marble pools. He had never studied Ottoman history. More disturbing still, medical reports from the late Ottoman period, only recently declassified, describe hereditary mental illness running through royal bloodlines, sultans, princes, and pashas. Many were treated secretly by palace doctors using opium, belladonna, and mercury. The records were sanitized, the symptoms reframed as divine melancholy or spiritual visions. But in the margins, always the margin scribes left the truth. The Padishah chooses robe when alone. He weeps at shadows. He speaks to birds and fears reflections. One name appears again and again: Ibrahim, and the violence didn't stop with him. His descendants, especially through the line of Mehmed IV, continued to suffer. Mehmed, who had watched his father strangled and crowned on the same day, would rule for nearly 4 decades, but he ruled with coldness, with distance, with rituals of control so rigid they bordered on obsessive-compulsive. Some historians believe this was not strength, it was trauma, calcified into ceremony. His children would be silent, broken rulers. His court became quieter. His mother Turhan Sultan would die under mysterious circumstances. Some say poisoned by a vengeful servant who lost a sister to Ibrahim's purge. Even today, Ibrahim's reign haunts the cultural memory of Turkey. He is rarely taught in schools. His portrait, once on display in museums, is now kept in archives. His name is missing from many tourist guides to Topkapi Palace, but he lives on in whispers. In Turkish, the phrase "I be Rahim gibi olma," don't be like Ibrahim, is still used in some rural regions to warn children against impulsiveness or cruelty. In folktales, there are monsters called Guldran Padasartha, Shadow Sultan, who drowns girls and speaks in riddles. Children are told to stay away from wells, or he will rise again when the moon is silent. They are fairy tales, but we know what inspired them. The past has teeth. It bites, even through centuries, even when clothed in silk and ceremony. Ibrahim. Life is a warning, but not just of one man's descent into madness. It is a warning about systems that prioritize blood over character, ritual over reality, silence over accountability. He was not born a monster. He was made one, by fear, by isolation, by a world that crowned him with one hand and crushed his soul with the other. And if we look closely at any empire, any regime, any family, any institution that rewards obedience over humanity, we will find that shadow again, that waits in corridors, in archives, in dreams. In the final, we will step away from the palisade into the soul, because history does not end with facts, it ends with memory, and the moral is never written by the victor, but by the survivor. In the end, it was not the madness that haunted them, not the drowned girls, not the screams behind silk, not even the gold that vanished into the sea. It was the silence. The empire learned to live with it, decorating its pain with rituals, covering its guilt with prayer and power. But the silence never left. It clung to the walls of the palace like mildew. It settled into the stone floor of the cage long after it was abandoned. It hummed beneath every coronation, every prayer, every whisper of Padisham Kokyara, "Long live my sultan." And sometimes it sounded like a boy crying in the dark. Ibrahim was not a villain in the way we prefer our villains. He was not power-hungry, not strategic, not calculating. He was broken, a man who had never seen the sun until adulthood, a child whose first memory may have been the muffled sobs of his brothers. The night before they were strangled, he was crowned not because he was ready, or worthy, or loved. He was crowned because he was next. And that's what makes his story so terrifying. Because systems, be they empires, corporations, families, or faiths, often don't choose the best. They choose the inevitable. They choose the one who survives the slaughter. And what happens when the survivor is too shattered to rule? The same thing that happened in 1640. If we peel back the layers of blood and myth, if we wipe away the gold, dust and perfume, we're left with something almost unbearably human. A boy locked in a room for 22 years. A man given the power of God without the tools to be a man. A mother who ruled through her son until he became too dangerous to love. That's the true horror, not the crimes, but how preventable they were. Had Ibrahim been taught to read, had he been given a friend, a mentor, a voice that spoke truth without fear, had he known touch without violence, this would not have been his story. But it was, and now it is ours, because we must ask, what systems are we still building that make monsters, then punish them for being monstrous? What cages do we build for children with the wrong name, the wrong gender, the wrong mind? What rituals do we defend, long after we've forgotten why they exist? What rulers do we choose, not because they are right, but because they are next? There are echoes of Ibrahim in every society, in every institution where silence is safer than truth, where obedience is rewarded more than compassion, where trauma is inherited, not healed. History is not just something to learn, it is something to break so that it does not repeat, because the cage may be gone, but its design still lingers in prisons, in orphanages, in toxic households, in boardrooms, in thrones. And so, as the palace doors of Topkapi closed behind him for the final time, as the guards sealed the chamber and the empire moved on, one truth remained, cold and echoing in the dark. The most dangerous crown is the one placed on a child who never got to be one. History is not a story of rulers, it is a story of wounds, and if we ignore them, they bleed forward. So remember, Ibrahim not as a tyrant, not as a myth, not even as a king, but as a boy in a cage, a boy who screamed for 22 years, and when he was finally heard, he screamed so loudly, the empire still trembles, and as the palace doors closed for the last time, a darker secret still remained. If this story moved you, I invite you to reflect not on empires past, but on the cages we still build today, and next time, we'll step into another forgotten corner of history, where the silence still speaks. Until then, listen closely, because history never sleeps.